Hello everyone. Today I am going to be talking about Marxism after Marx's death in 1883. As I said in week one, Karl Marx is one of those huge figures in human history, likened to Jesus and Muhammad, and rather like those religions that followed in their wake. Marxism after Marx's death splintered into many types of Marxism, and many of those were antagonistic to each other. According to David English, this diversity of uses of his ideas and the different directions for them can be partly attributed to the fact that Marx wanted his ideas to lead to practical outcomes. He wanted the working class to struggle against what he saw as the things that were wrong with capitalism, the exploitation of the workers, the alienation of the workers from their work and from themselves. And remember that he was contemptuous of philosophy, which he regarded as merely explaining the world, whereas he wanted to change the world. So for Marx, theory was a guide to action. By diagnosing the capitalist system in order to understand how it worked, how it could be changed, and he wanted to be able to figure out how it could be changed, and that was really Marx's aim. The fracturing of Marx ended up into two major divisions, Eastern and Western. Eastern Marxism is usually associated with the official position of the Soviet Union, which was a communist state, as you probably all know, set up in Russia in 1917 when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew a temporary government that had replaced the last emperor of Russia, Nicholas II. The USSR, which claimed a commitment to Marxist ideals, lasted then until 1991. A major problem with the sort of communist revolution that happened in Russia was that Marx had predicted A, that a socialist or communist revolution was going to happen, it was nigh, and B, that the end of capitalism was nigh, which always reminds me of the early Christians and even some today who believe that there will be the second coming of Christ. And what do you do when that doesn't happen? And what do you do when Marx was clearly wrong? He believed that the workers' revolution would happen first in the most developed capitalist nations, which he thought of as Great Britain and the United States, whereas the communist revolution in Russia seemed to contradict Marx's forecast. Capitalism was still fairly new to Russia, and in comparison to those other countries. When the revolution got started there, it was still seen as quite economically backward. Terry Eagleton actually argues that for communism, as Marx imagined it to happen, it needed to occur in an advanced capitalist economy where people's needs were already being easily met because of the wealth that capitalism had generated. Because of what had happened, the lack of a revolution in the United States and in Great Britain, the revolution that had happened in Russia, and then there were two world wars and the rise of fascism, of course, which Marx hadn't predicted either, fascism in Germany. At the end of the First World War, Marxists were scratching their heads, wondering how come the revolution had happened in Russia and how come the revolution hadn't occurred in advanced capitalist economies like the UK and the States. And I guess there were kind of two possibilities, some argue. A, that Marx was wrong, and B, capitalism was actually a lot more resilient than Marx had predicted, and therefore there must have been some blockages to the revolution somewhere. If these blockages could be identified, then Marxists could set about removing them, and then the revolution could proceed. So according to David McLennan, most Marxists in the West believed that there were two major forms of resistance to revolution. The ruling classes have the capacity for physical repression of a people. They have the army, they have the police, which can be used to subdue the population. Think about what happens when there's a strike or the threat of one, when the police are out in force, and apologies for my misspelling there, but this can only this physical repression or the use of the armed forces can only be temporary, because eventually people will rise up against them. And what comes to mind for me when I think about that is Gandhi and the brutality of the English police in India, which eventually ended the rule of the British in India, because people around the world rose up actually against that violence. So to secure long-term security of a society, the ruling classes need to have another option, a much more subtle one, and the idea of ideological repression. Much more subtle, they need to be able to control minds. So if most people believe that the way things are at the moment is the natural order of things, is the legitimate way that things should be done, that then there won't be any uprising, because it's just the way that it is. So ideological repression or control is most effective because or when it doesn't occur to people that there's actually anything wrong with the social order as it is now. Therefore, for most Western Marxists during the 20th century, the aim has been to reveal the ways in which ideological repression or control of minds has occurred, and how this has particularly occurred to the middle classes, who were the people being subjected to that sort of control. By doing this, the Marxists could believe that they could then undermine those mechanisms and encourage a revolution. So their aim was, first of all, to find out what hindered a revolution, and secondly, to find out what the resistances to manipulation by the ruling classes existed as well, and how that might happen. So these Marxists began to put a lot more emphasis on culture, on ideas, values, symbols, ways of thinking, much more so than what Marx had done. And because it seemed that culture was the primary reason for the lack of a revolution in the West. This reworking of Marx also seemed necessary because of what was actually going on in Russia, or the USSR as it was by then. After Lenin died in 1924 and Stalin took over, there were thousands of people sent off to prison camps, thousands of people who were seen as a potential threat to Stalin's rule. So the lack of democracy in Russia, and really what was a physical repression, was very different to what Marx had envisaged as communism. In his mind, what he saw as in writings was a society in which individuals had freedom. And they certainly didn't seem to be having that in Russia. So George Lukács was born in Budapest, Hungary. His father was a banker who changed the family's Jewish surname to a Hungarian one, and the family were later admitted to the nobility. And this became an issue later on in the Western Marxist movement. The young George was interested in literature and drama, and he joined the Hungarian Communist Party in 1918, to the surprise of many. Not that the Communist Party wasn't home to many upper and middle class people, because it was. So we're talking about this guy, George Lukács, because he was the first Western Marxist, or regarded as such, who drew upon the work of the young Hegel influenced Marx. So one of his central ideas was that of a social totality, how every single part of a society is completely interrelated with other parts, which is very much a contemporary idea, that we're all interconnected actually. Therefore, change in one part has ramifications or implications for all the other parts. If there is a totality, he believed, then culture actually can't be shaped directly by the economic base. Remember Marx talking about the economic base. But by the same token, nor could the economy actually shape everything else in a society. He also argued that Marx was critiquing this idea of reification. So reification is making something real, a thing of it, what people might call the thingification of social relations. So as an example, in capitalist economies, what we talk about is the market as if it is actually a thing with a life of its own, quite independent of social relationships, but it's not. The market is actually the result of people interacting with each other. And if people ceased trading, which they're not likely to, but if they did, there would be no market. So Lukács believed that the aim of Marxism was to identify this thing-like thinking or reification, and by pointing out that what seems like thing-like and therefore unchangeable, it's just the way that it is, by pointing it out that it's actually not unchangeable, that it is actually just simple social relationships which can be changed, actually has a great deal of possibility for the future. Although, I must say, as we saw with Garfinkel's work in week 6, people tend to get a bit upset, even quite angry, when we try to change how we interact with them. So there's that. But it still leads to a lot of possibility for change. And remember, these are Marxists who are wanting to find ways to undermine the capitalist system and encourage revolution. The Frankfurt School followed George Lukács' lead in reworking Marxism to avoid both the atrocities of Stalinist Marxism and identify the ways in which capitalist ideology is repressive. So the Frankfurt School was an informal affiliation of social theorists and philosophers associated with the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, and that's based at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. There were two versions of the Frankfurt School, one from the 1920s to the 1960s, and then a later version more associated with Jürgen Habermas, who became director of the Institute for Social Research in the late 1960s. The early version was around during times of enormous turmoil as Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in Germany, something that, as I said before, Marx had not predicted. They were a very interdisciplinary group, so there were characters like sociologist Theodor Adorno, who was also a philosopher and a composer as well. There were philosophers like Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, Walter Benjamin. There were also psychologists, Freudian psychologists like Erich Fromm and Friedrich Pollock, who was a political economist. So there was a great deal of diversity and interdisciplinarity in this loose kind of affiliation. Most of these men came from well-off German Jewish families, and this informed some of the criticism later on of their work. So one of the interesting themes that developed were the similarities between the totalitarian regimes in Russia and Germany and the land of the free, America. Many of these men actually had to leave Germany and flee to the US for safety, but when they arrived in the US, discovered that the mass media, as in those other countries, was actually being used to control the population. So consequently, the Frankfurt School's analysis of the mass media was the first, or recognised as the first, to explore the effects of the media on the audience. The Frankfurt School were anti-positivist. So remember that positivists thought that we could use the natural scientists, think back to the week on Durkheim, use the research methods that are used by the natural sciences to research society and locate some general laws and social facts. The Frankfurt School were quite adamant, however, that positivism is not neutral, that it actually works in the interests of the most powerful. So what they wanted to do was uncover all of the hidden ways that society works. And again, this reminds me of Garfinkel as well, but perhaps without the political, the Marxists have a political edge which Garfinkel was accused of not having. So anyway, so Garfinkel did want to uncover the hidden ways that society works, and that's what the Frankfurt School wanted to do as well. But they wanted to discover what it's really like with their political aim of encouraging change. In doing that, therefore, they thought that you needed to be skeptical of absolutely everything, and therefore they rejected people's own understandings of how society works because they saw that as contaminated by ruling class ways. They certainly didn't pretend to be unbiased, as they argued positivists did, but rather they were clear they had this utopian vision of freedom for all, from repression, from domination, from subjugation. So critical theory points out the hypocrisies of a society, how societies say they are one thing, like they're democratic, but actually do something else, which is not take into account everyone's views. So they argue that the capitalism says it's all about individual freedom, but in reality what it does is restrict freedom. So individual freedom is actually an illusion. Adorno and Horkheimer were informed by the ideas of Sigmund Freud, and Max Weber for that matter, amongst others, to argue that capitalism had changed since Marx was around. In Marx's time, they said, the feature of capitalism was that there was a lot of competition between different companies. But by the time, the end of the Second World War, the middle of the 20th century, capitalism, they believed, had entered into a monopoly phase, which saw these supersized companies like Ford, the Ford Motor Company, gain economic control, and we've certainly seen an expansion of that now. Therefore, they said, culture was critical to the functioning of capitalism, and it was in the service of capitalism. So critical thinking was being replaced by control over people's minds by the media industry, the entertainment industry, what they called the culture industry. So these gigantic media corporations produce the media, the films, the television, newspaper, magazines, etc., for the majority of the population to consume. They were doing so in service to capitalism, and they had a monopoly over the culture. So the theorists saw that creativity and art of the past were actually being used to create ads to sell white goods like fridges and washing machines, and as well as cars. Consumer goods were being used to buy off the working class, is what they thought, to turn them into passive consumers, no longer thinking critically or even able to think for themselves, which seems a little harsh. So they argued that pseudo-individuality is pushed onto people. The goods are standardised, but actually promoted and sold as distinctive, as we would all be aware of. That still happens today. So in contrast to individuality and critical thinking, people are being sold conformity. So Adorno and Horkheimer made a distinction between what they saw as the complexity of art in all its forms, music, etc., which, because it was complex, often quite difficult, promoted critical thinking, and what they saw as the simplicity of mass or pop culture, which promoted thoughtlessness in the sense of it didn't make you think on the part of listeners to pop music, for example, and conformity. Moreover, they believed that people were now so passive that they didn't even really want what the culture industry produced, but instead were consuming it because they were responding to false needs that were implanted into their consciousness by the culture industry. Unsurprisingly, by the 1960s, the Frankfurt School were being criticised for being out of touch with the general population, which was in large part attributed to their upper middle class background. So they're calling on some of their education in terms of high art and high culture to criticise the way in which the bulk of people were consuming these mass products, and therefore assuming that they were doing so in a passive way. So I can understand the criticisms that came, and it's certainly something that I would certainly be critical of for them as well. So critics argue that they were much too pessimistic, that they actually did miss opportunity for changes in the culture, and they missed the critical elements in popular music as well. And critics said that they were wrong in thinking that the human mind was utterly subject to manipulation. And of course, another criticism, certainly of mine, is that these are the only minds that aren't being manipulated, which actually sounds a little bit arrogant. From the late 1960s, there's a younger group of critical theorists who had turned to the work of Herbert Marcuse, who was exploring his particularly Freudian psychological version of critical theory to analyse the emerging social movements such as the anti-Vietnam movement. So Marcuse had a much more optimistic view that suggested critical theory could embrace social changes rather than just criticise them and toss them out. It's Jürgen Habermas who led a group of younger theorists who thought it was time to revamp critical theory. So Marxism was revamped, and now the revamping of Marxism is being revamped. Habermas was interested in the promise of freedom in modern society. He was interested in identifying and encouraging what he saw as positive change, rather than only arguing that modernity was just a bureaucratic prison, an iron cage that we all live in, controlled by the ruling classes. At this early stage of his work, so we're talking about the late 1960s, early 1970s, he saw critical theory as being rather like a psychoanalyst treating a patient, the patient being modern society. Critical theory could work with modern society to show how human consciousness was repressed by unseen forces, and you can certainly see the influence of Freud there with the unconscious, and help the patient through those blockages and then into freedom. So Habermas wanted society to see its strengths and to encourage more of those. He showed how in the 18th century a public sphere had developed where educated middle-class citizens could meet and discuss politics and philosophy, where a consensus could be reached, where people didn't just win arguments because they were the most powerful person. And this is what's known as a discursive democracy. By the 19th century, of course, the government and the market were dominating this public sphere through the media. But the aim of this new version, or this revamping of critical theory, was to show that people could resist. They could take back the public sphere, and that it could be a whole lot less restrictive than in the past. That is, not only open to the educated middle class as it would have been in the 18th century, because the working class would have been at home doing all the cleaning up and the work for the middle class who could sit around and chat. Habermas argued for what he called undistorted communication. He said that every time somebody speaks, they implicitly make 4 claims. That what they say is intelligible, that what they say is true, that they are justified in what they say, and that they are sincere in what they are saying. Because this is usually implicit, it's implied, he believed that the speaker will have to defend themselves, including with evidence to prove that what they are saying meets the above criteria. So an ideal speech condition then is one where there is no distorted communication, or where communication is the least distorted. Everyone can join the conversation, everyone can question any assertion that is made, everyone can introduce an assertion, everyone is free to express their own attitudes, beliefs and needs, and no speaker is prevented from exercising their right to speak. Habermas advanced these ideals of an ideal speech condition way ahead of the World Wide Web, but I think it's possible to see how the web holds out, and this is certainly mentioned in the textbook as well, that how the web holds out the possibility of this kind of free communication around the world. He argues that there is the system, which is made up of the government, institutions, and the capitalist market, but there's also the life world, and this is probably more of his later work, life world, which is made up of all the social relations between people. So his aim was to reverse the process, so that instead of having the social relations, the life world, colonized or dominated by the system, the opposite would happen through this ideal communication. Through this would be able, this undistorted communication would move out of the life world, out of those relationships where it's been happening, and into the system. And if the life world could do that, then it would restructure the system. So instead of seeing the working class as the revolutionary group, as Marx had proposed, Habermas saw the new social movements, the Greens, the environmental movement, the women's movement, the gay and lesbian rights movements, as the new agents of change, promoting positive transformation of the system. Somebody else that I want to talk about is Antonio Gramsci, who was a leader in the Italian Communist Party in the 1920s. Now, he was actually from the working class. He had a short and very difficult life. He'd begun work at the age of 11. He worked 10 hours a day for a while his father was in prison for embezzlement. After his father came out of prison, he was actually able to go back to school and won a scholarship then to study at the University of Turin for a little while anyway. He was very poor and not in good health, and so eventually he needed to abandon his studies. Gramsci spent 10 years from 1927 as a political prisoner in Italy. He died very shortly after his release, having what Lynn Law says, having almost quite literally rotted away as a result of being in prison. He had what she says was an avalanche of devastating illnesses: vomiting, insomnia, tuberculosis, Pott's disease, numerous other ailments, and eventually his teeth fell out too, and he was a nervous wreck. So he had an absolutely awful time in prison. And yet, despite those physical devastations and being besieged, I guess, by a condition called acidity, or what we might think of as depression while he was in prison, he continued to read, he continued to think, and he continued to write. And he did his writing on these tiny little squares of paper, and every inch of which was crowded with this really small but very perfect writing. In 1947, the writings were published, and Gramsci's reputation as a major Marxist theoretician was established in Italy as well as internationally. So Gramsci saw human life as the clash between conflicting views of the world, views of what human beings are like, how society is, and how it should be. He was interested in the idea of mental welfare, how the ruling classes impose their worldviews on subordinate classes. But also he was interested in how subordinate classes resist this and cultivate their own visions of society, and those visions can help to change things. So Gramsci was one of the first Western Marxists to argue that physical restraint by the ruling class is not enough to secure a stable social system that works in favour of the ruling classes. Instead, he said, it's ideological and cultural repression that's needed. And he used the term cultural hegemony for this. So the word hegemony is Greek in origin and means an indirect influence, rule or control by one group over another, rather than by that direct rule by the military force. So it refers more to the threat of force, I guess, or what much more subtle means, like, for example, knowing that you can't be a whistleblower and still keep your job. So there's that threat of force going on there that'll keep you in control. So Gramsci took the word hegemony and applied it culturally to the idea that the one social class, the bourgeoisie or the middle class, can dominate in what he called civil society, socially as well as politically, by normalising their values and mores. Thus, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, become the ruling class. The idea has been now applied much more widely, for example, to the cultural dominance of America and to a particular type of masculinity which continues to subordinate women. However, he was also interested in the idea that the ruling class hegemony is always very fragile. He suggests, unlike some of the other theorists that I've been talking about, he wasn't totally opposed to the idea of gathering evidence. He suggested an empirical approach to investigate where the cracks are appearing, For example, prolonged periods of unemployment will likely make the working classes very sceptical of what the bosses and the government says. Therefore, counter-hegemonic forces can happen in very unexpected ways and yet change everything. So, just to finish off, I did want to say that despite the parade of men in this week's lecture, both Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels did argue against the oppression of women. After Marx's death, Engels wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, and argued that women's oppression emerged from the rise of the class society and the nuclear family, i.e. mum, dad and the kids. However, not all Marxists have sought the liberation of women, and some would argue that socialist or Marxist feminism has received fairly short shrift from both feminists and from Marxists. And Marxist feminists emerged in the context, even though there would have been first wave feminists who were interested in Marxists, this kind of label or category or term is more used from the time of the second wave movement of feminism or the women's liberation movement from the late 1960s and early 1970s. So Marxist feminists are around, and I think that they need to be seen there alongside these other sorts of Western feminists as well. As Marxist feminists argue the very problematic nature of the gendered division of labour. So in the capitalist system, there are two types of labour. There's productive labour, which is seen as resulting in the production of goods and service, and it has a monetary value. And then there's reproductive labour, which is the things that people need to do to take care of themselves, to reproduce their labour, and which don't have a monetary value, so cooking, cleaning and raising children. What Marxist feminists demonstrate is that in capitalist economies, reproductive labour is usually considered women's work, and because there is no monetary value attached to that, it's less valued. Because women's labour is devalued, women are devalued, is the way in which the argument goes. Therefore, Marxist or socialist feminists believe that capitalism is the source of women's oppression. Except, of course, that oppression of women exists outside of capitalism too. But just to mention a few key figures in case you would like to explore these for yourself. So some key figures in Marxist feminism are New Zealander Julia Mitchell, who, like many of the men that I've talked about, was most interested in Freud's psychoanalytic theory, but she was particularly interested in the gendered socialization of children. American Barbara Ehrenreich, who argues for the interconnection between the class struggle and women's struggles, and therefore she says that all of those who want freedom for the working class also need to be struggling for the freedom of women too. And British woman Sheila Rowbotham, who argues that women's oppression is the result of both economic and cultural forces, and therefore change is needed in both the private and the public spheres in order for the liberation of women to happen. So again, as I've wanted to do all semester, I did just want to alert you to the work of some women, even though the course has been designed primarily around men. So just to sum up, Western Marxism refers to those Marxists in Western countries who didn't want to give up on Marx, but who found problems with his theories and were certainly very concerned about Stalinist Russia, and that the prophesied revolution did not happen in the industrialized countries as Marx had predicted. Trying to figure out why it didn't happen as predicted led to an analysis of capitalist ideology, so values, beliefs, culture, as a restraining force on the consciousness of the working class. By the end of the Second World War, Western Marxism was actually primarily located in universities, so it had become more an academic than an activist movement. There are some contemporary key figures if you'd like to look at those. There's Perry Anderson, Terry Eagleton and Frederick Jameson. And thank you for listening.